QSO Today, episode 293, Michael Rainey, AA1TJ. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that they have just the right rig for contesters, DXers, and rag chewers. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. This week, we're going back in time to February 2016, when Mike Rainey, AA1TJ, was my guest in episode 80. This week, I'm playing the original interview with Mike, but remastered to sound better because we know more than we did then. Mike originally attracted my attention then from his YouTube video where he is yelling into a tomato can to create a sound-powered QRP signal on 80 meters. Mike is the guy you want to have with you on a desert island, capable of building a transmitter from whatever is handy. QSO Today, episode 80, Mike Rainey, AA1TJ. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. I saw a video on YouTube of a ham shouting Morse code into a tomato can to transmit a sound-powered RF signal over the air. Of course, my reaction was that this was a clever invention by an amateur radio operator, with whom, if you had to spend time on a desert island, you would want him to be your companion. My guest today, Mike Rainey, AA1TJ, is the same ham and has an interesting story to tell. AA1TJ, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Mike?
For Z1UG, this is AA1TJ. Yes, I am, Eric.
Mike, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I would have to go back to my Cub Scout days, age 7. The handbook had a schematic and a drawing of a crystal radio, and that just captured my imagination. I never actually built the radio. It seemed far too complex for anyone to build, but it at least gave me an idea of this thing called radio and the idea that you could build such things. So that, again, that was the age of 7. I retained an interest, kind of a growing interest in shortwave listening. My parents had a Philips, I remember a Philips radio. It had AM and some shortwave bands. We kept it on our kitchen counter. And I remember it was one of those dials that had the cities listed. And I thought it was remarkable that you could this little box, you could turn the knob to match, the pointer match a city and magically hear it. Now, unfortunately, it was out of date and I never was able to match up the dial with the cities, but again, it gave me a sense of this magic of this thing called radio. I finally went for my ham license after I met a fellow down the street named Dennis J. McCarthy, a very fine gentleman. His call was KB0YTI. He's from St. Louis, Missouri, which is where I grew up. And Dennis had 9 sons of his own and a daughter, none of which were interested in radio, but he made time for a kid from down the block who had an interest. And so it was through Dennis that I got my novice license. That was 1970, 71. I can't quite remember which it was, but that time period. My first rig was an Amico AC1, which a lot of people will be familiar with. It was a 6V6 GT oscillator, pentode oscillator, crystal controlled, and it put out about somewhere around 5 watts. I used it with a 40-meter dipole strung on a city lot. It was up around 15 feet, so it was putting most of its energy straight up. And so I made over 500 QSOs with that radio, but that transmitter. Never worked any DX. DX for me was working New York State from St. Louis. But I had a great time with it.
You grew up in the St. Louis area?
That's right, yeah. My father was in the military, and we traveled everywhere. We lived in North Africa for a couple of years, and this is where we pretty much ended up when he got out of the service.
What kind of receiver did you use with the AC1?
It was a radio I bought from a store down the street, Radio Shack, which is my only supply store in those days. It was a DX120.
The Amico had the TR switch built in?
No. I used a double pull, double throw, a knife switch, a Frankenstein style knife switch to go between transmit and receive.
High voltage on the knife switch?
Well, they did have a series blocking capacitor in the.
You upgraded not long after that?
It was about a year, and I got my general license. And with that, a friend told me there was a CBer down the block that had an old DX100 Heathkit transmitter and wanted $15 or something for it. So I remember with his help, we went down the street with a little red wagon and pulled the beast back home and helped me lug it up the stairs into my bedroom. And I used that to work my first DX on 15 and then 20 meters. So, yeah, I enjoyed that.
You've remained a CW operator throughout this time, or did you ever take any soirees into other bands and modes?
Well, that would be with that DX100. After I got my general license, I tuned up one day on 40 meters with AM, and my first contact gave me a scolding for having a carrier and an extra sideband. So I switched away, and that was pretty much my last phone contact.
How did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Well, I went to school to study philosophy, of all things. I got bored of it after about 2 years. I dropped out and joined the Coast Guard. So ham radio and the interest in electronics kind of came and went in that time period. But I eventually did pick it up after I got out of the Coast Guard. I went to work for Washington University at their medical school and worked as a technician, kind of learning on the job. I worked there for 4 years. After that, I went to work for an ultrasonic medical device company as a technician. Let's see, then an intracranial pressure monitor manufacturer, again in the medical industry. And finally, I worked for 24 years for WCX Television here in Vermont. Kind of an unusual job. I was a transmitter operator on top of a 4,000-foot mountain, Vermont's highest mountain, Mount Mansfield. And I would typically go to work at Friday evening and stay up alone on top of the mountain in their transmitter hut until Sunday evening. And again, I did that for 24 years and retired in 2012.
When you were in the Coast Guard, were you involved in any technical aspect of the Coast Guard? Was it a technical job that you had there?
No, I was a seaman. It's just a grunt.
Patrolling the shores of America.
Yeah, in San Francisco, I was lucky enough to be out and loved it out there. And then Cape Cod, spent time in Cape Cod and Woods Hole, another place I go back every year. So,
one of my earlier QSO Today guests also was quite philosophical and also joined the Coast Guard, where he was an electronic engineer for a while. I didn't think he'd become an engineer, but he's probably one of the better ones that I know.
Oh, excellent.
What kind of impact does amateur radio have, or did it have on your family life?
My wife did become a ham. She got a lot. She has her technician's license, although I'm sorry to say she's never been on the air. So I think she did it to show an affinity and a support of my hobby. I actually got back on the air after a long break in 2007, and I've been at it pretty steady since 2007. But there was a break when I was interested in physics and mathematics. I collected mathematical instruments. For a period, I got back into crystal radios. I would build crystal shortwave radios and listen to them. I spent a winter listening to non-directional beacons, low-frequency beacons, with a one-tube receiver that I had built, regenerative receiver. So it was kind of sputtering off and on for many years. Again, I was doing it during the day and a lot of electronics during the day, and it was one of those things where you just didn't feel like doing it when you got home in the evening. I felt like doing something different.
When you were working those 24 years in the transmitter hut on the tallest mountain in Vermont, did that give you time to work on any projects or Were you mostly a reader, or?
In the early days, I read a lot. I read and looked out the window, looked out the telescope a lot. When the internet came in, I read less books and and played more on the internet. It did give me quite a lot of time. It was a perfect job for a person like me, a person with, as I say, many interests, and it gave me time to pursue the things that I was interested in.
As I told you before we started, I had a chance to find your old website on the Wayback Machine. I took some time looking over the body of work that you published online and was somehow taken more with your approach to our ham radio art than the technology itself. There's a philosophy that drives you more than MacGyver cleverness, I think. Was there a mentor or event in your growing up that planted this way of looking at the world?
Oh, that's a tough one, Eric. I can't think why I came to like and enjoy the sort of things that I do. That's an excellent question. I suppose I bought when I got out of boot camp. They had held my pay for 3 months while I was in boot camp with the Coast Guard, and then they gave me a big fat check. It was more money I'd ever had in my hands at one time. So I went out and bought a Yaesu FT301 SD transceiver, and it was the thing that I had always aspired to have, this brand new state-of-the-art beautiful transceiver, and I had it for about 3 months. It just wasn't what I was into. I was more interested and had more excitement in the time, for instance, when I had just gotten my general, and I built one transistor oscillator using a field effect transistor, and it put out about 15 to 20 milliwatts, and I remember making a contact from St. Louis with a fellow in Rochester, Minnesota, and I just thought that was the coolest thing. So I knew right away, I sold the transceiver, I knew right away that this kind of wasn't for me, that I was going to be more of I don't know if you want to say the MacGyver type, but I was more interested in building everything. As a matter of fact, my last commercial radio that I've owned was an HW8. That was 1981 when I purchased that, and I sold that when I moved to Vermont in '84. So that was my last commercial piece of gear. When I got back on the air in 2007, I decided that I would only do ham radio with all homebrew equipment, and whenever possible with salvaged equipment. Lucky for me, I have a big junk box due to my time up on the mountain, and they went through several generations of transmitters, most of which have been taken apart and now reside in little boxes in my shack.
Well, in 2008, you got an idea to make a working transmitter from the components from a discarded compact fluorescent bulb. What inspired this project, and how did it turn out?
It was a spur-of-the-moment thing. We had a light go out. My wife asked me to change a light bulb over the kitchen counter. As I was taking the bulb out, I was literally unscrewing it and thinking, gee, I wonder what sort of electronics are in this. And so I took it down to my shop and got a hacksaw and opened it up and found a couple of transistors. And so it just went from there. And I had a great time with that. I built a transmitter with that, made a bunch of contacts, and then thought, get another bulb, make a receiver. So I did that as well. And that was a lot of fun. So I actually, the other thing I did was when I retired from the mountain, from Mount Mansfield, my old electric razor, my Braun electric razor, it was ready for the scrap heap. So I thought I'd do the same thing with that. I opened it up and found all these little surface mount transistors, and I thought, okay, I'm going to make a radio with this. So I made a transmitter and receiver and made a bunch of QSOs again, and ended up talking with a fellow in France. And so as I mentioned, I get a kick out of telling people that I've talked to France on my electric razor.
Which is pretty much the truth. But there are some other parts that you certainly added to this as well to make this whole thing work.
That's right. When I used the compact fluorescent bulb, I used as many of the components as I possibly could and tried to use them in innovative or inventive ways where you would normally have to go out and get another component. For instance, I added another winding to an audio, not an audio, to an inductor and turned it to a transformer, that sort of thing. So I went out of my way to use as many components as possible. Of course, I needed a quartz crystal to set the frequency, but certainly all the active devices and many of the passive devices were from the compact fluorescent bulb.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get outside and be active with ICOM's new IC705 HF to UHF portable transceiver and its optional multifunction backpack. This is ICOM's perfect solution for SOTA and parks on the air. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion with its base station features and functionality at the tips of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds. This beautiful new rig has RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz, and includes a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with a live band scope and waterfall display. The ICOM IC705 will be the replacement and amazing 21st century baseband rig for microwave DXers, rovers, and contesters, and the operating choice for those under the new S-HAIL geosynchronous satellite footprint. Unbelievable. The radio is 5 watts with its internal battery and 10 watts with an external 13.8-volt power supply. This full-featured radio operates on single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Included in this package is a micro USB connector, Bluetooth to support linking to your smartphone or Bluetooth headset, built-in Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone, which is standard equipment. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 with plenty of room for antennas, cables, and other gear to get you on the air from the mountaintop or the local park. There is a link to this amazing new rig on the QSO Today podcast website for this episode, and when you order your new ICOM IC705 from your favorite ham radio dealer, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. What is the New England Code Talker?
That was an idea I had for generating a radio frequency signal using the power from my voice. I had read in a physics book one time that if everyone in New York City were to talk at once, it would power, I believe they said, a 60-watt light bulb. And it was supposed to convey the understanding that there is very little energy associated with our voice, with the acoustic energy. And I was curious about that. So I got an olive can out of the recycle bin, and I found a dynamic loudspeaker in my junk box. And I cut the both ends off the olive can, or the back end off the olive can, and taped the loudspeaker to it. I did some experiments, and I found out that if I were to make a fairly close coupling to the acoustic cavity, that I was seeing some appreciable power, 10 to 20 milliwatts. And I thought, okay, I could do something with this. So I built I started on 80 meters. I built a 1-transistor oscillator. I rectified the energy from this can and loudspeaker. And my first contact, actually, I didn't start with Morse code. I tried to use this on AM. It was a fellow over in Maine who heard one of my beacons one day, another project I had going, a very early transistor germanium, point contact germanium transistor project. He heard my beacon one day, and he called me on the phone and said, "Mike, I hear this signal." And as we were talking, he said, "Well, I hear a back wave between your key down periods." And I said, "That's interesting. You're hearing It was less than 100 microwatts he was hearing from Vermont to Maine, and so he was hearing this incredibly low signal levels. So I just so happened I had the olive can in the arrangement on the bench, and I tried to use it on AM. So he was happy to oblige, and I remember the morning we were doing these experiments on 80 meters. He was hearing me just fine. I mean, there was plenty of signal, but the modulation was terrible. It was very difficult for him to understand. It was pitiful. So we had a funny exchange where I was making changes on my circuit as he was, and he would give me feedback on how I sounded. I remember at one point he said, "You sound like a dog," and then I'd say, "Okay, I'm going to make the change. I'm changing this part of the circuit," and then I would try again, and he'd say, "That's better. You sound like a seal now." So I wanted so badly to make the QSO because he was not copying my signal report, and he could not copy my call sign because of the distortion. So all of a sudden, a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, "Wait a minute, you're a ham radio operator. You know Morse code." And so I started going da 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 da, and of course he came right back and said, "Perfect copy." He's coming back to me on AM, saying, "Perfect copy." Nope. So we made the QSO, and so from there I switched over to code, what I call the New England Code Talker. That's what I named it, and I had a great time with that. On 80 meters, using the power of my voice, I talked to people in the Carolinas, both North and South Carolina, Georgia, all over. I have one memorable QSO. It was with Dale Parfit, W4 Oscar Papa, and Dale had a very nice copy on me that day, and I remember. I'm having to give it all my I'm giving my operatic voice, and I'm just bellowing into this tin can, and I had this Zen moment, I guess you could say, where I felt the wave coming out of my chest, this acoustic wave, this force of energy, and then I could envision. I had this vision of the wave, bouncing off the ionosphere, and it almost was enough to give you spins in the chair. But it was a very memorable QSO for that reason. I really felt as if I was part of the machine, as they say. So that was exciting. Another fellow heard me as far away as Louisiana. I think he was a physics instructor. He went to the club station when he heard about this operation, and copied me on the club station out there in Louisiana. So I did move it up to 20 meters, made some contacts. I tried to cross the pond with it. I was not successful at that time, unfortunately, but again, had a great time with it.
There's a video online on YouTube of you doing Morse code into the olive can. Did you change the design so that you were actually keying the transmitter in CW mode with the sound, or was it always just AM?
Well, again, I started attempting to use it as an AM transmitter, but when that wasn't working out and the distortion was just a real problem, and I got into the physics of it a little bit and found out that there was a difference in energy between the vowels and the consonants as far as acoustic voice power, and so there was a fundamental problem with trying to transmit intelligible acoustic signal modulation in that way. Now, someone could probably add some sort of predistortion or whatever, manage to work around that. But once I figured out that CW would work, I was all off and into CW. That's my thing anyway. So when I would bellow da. It actually would key the transmitter because that's the DC pulse that would be generated and used by the oscillator to turn the oscillator on. So it both keyed the transmitter and powered it as well.
Now, what kind of antenna system do you have? Because you're operating milliwatts, microwatts. It's called what, QRPP?
That's right. Yeah, I'm into extreme QRPP, down in the milliwatt range. I don't think I have used more than 100 or 200 milliwatts in many years. Mostly, I'm 50 milliwatts and below. I've crossed the pond on half a dozen occasions with 10 milliwatts on 20 meters. But to answer your question, I have an inverted L. It's not a good antenna at all. It's the best I can do. Where I'm in the hills of Vermont. I have a small clearing, and my shack is underground. It's an underground. It's kind of a secret bunker. I call it the Hobbit hole, and it's on the edge of the clearing. So what I do is I bring the coax up to a tree where I have a tuner affixed to the side of a spruce tree, and the wire goes up a hill. There's no flat part on my land. Everything's very hilly here, and it's an 80-meter wavelength piece of wire, and I use it on all bands. It's very much of a compromise antenna, but surprisingly I do pretty well with QRPP. So all of those naysayers out there that says you actually have to have a resonant piece of wire and a lot of power to make a QSO, you're just proving them wrong here. Yeah. Again, I was surprised to do so well. I would be astonished probably if I ever had a decent antenna. I don't think I've ever in my ham radio career had a decent antenna, beginning with that 15-foot high dipole, 40-meter dipole that I had in a city lot, beneath all the phone lines and power lines and whatever. Yeah, if I ever had a beam on a tower or something like that, I would I wouldn't know what to do with it. Do you work any of the digital modes, or do you stick primarily with CW? No, I don't. I have not worked any digital modes so far. I saw a picture of a transceiver of yours on the Solder Smoke Daily News webpage, built completely on protoboard. You described a QSO that you made from Vermont to the Azores using a 50 milliwatt signal. These are very low QRP signals and are often heard on the digital modes like JT65, but I don't hear a lot of CW contacts at this power level. Can you describe this transceiver and what led to its creation? Oh, gosh, I build so many, Eric. Again, I don't have any commercial gear. And as a matter of fact, I don't really at this point have any gear that I've actually finished built into a cabinet. When I operate, I build something on a breadboard. This is the way I've been doing it for the last couple of years. I build something on the breadboard, usually the protoboard because I'm lazy. And I operate until I'm tired of that, of doing that particular thing, or move on to the next project. I take the board apart and build something new. So when I want to make a contact, I usually go down and build something first. The project on the breadboard at the present is a unijunction transistor putting out 120 microwatts on 80 meters. Again, it's just whatever I feel like doing at the moment is what I build.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
You built a transceiver called the Bell Ringer that looks like it went off the proto board and into a box.
Oh, yes, that was a rarity here. I did build that into a little box, and I think that appeared in a book somewhere. Someone asked to use that, take the information off my web page and use it in a book of some I think it was an English publication, a British publication. But that was, it started out with the idea to make a Pixie type radio where, where you're using the same parts of the circuit on transmit and receive with very slight changes without any heavy switching going on. And it kind of grew. It kind of got a little bit out of hand. It doesn't have the original flavor that is minimalist Pixie design. It got a little. I was using some audio filtering and that sort of thing. But I made a lot of contacts with that radio. It put out at 1.5 watts, as I remember, and I got tired of that because it's just too much. It seemed too easy to me, and so I. I don't have that rig anymore, and I'm more inclined to use milliwatts these days.
I'll put a link to the bell ringer on the website, and hopefully you'll actually extract all of these papers that you've done off of this webarchive.org site and put it back on your own, because this is really cool stuff. I spent an hour on your site before I even called you this morning. You're considered by Bill N3CQR, who was a guest of the QSO Today podcast, as the mad genius of the QRP world. What has been the attraction of the QRP mode, and how does this lead up to your unusual creations, or do you think it was the unusual creations that actually led to the QRP mode?
Well, first of all, Bill is very generous, but I've always been interested in puzzles. I spent a couple of years solving Japanese temple geometry puzzles. Someone interested, it's quite interesting. People back in the 1600s would actually post in temples geometrical problems for other people to solve. And two high school geometry teachers actually collaborated to produce a book. They went around Japan and collected these puzzles. And so I spent a couple of years just, it almost became an obsession with me. I would get up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and I would be solving these problems. So I'm into puzzles. That's one of my hobbies. So I suppose that plays into, I don't want it to be too easy. There's a certain level of difficulty it's the sweet spot. When things are too difficult, you give up. But when things are too easy, it's not interesting. So QSO for me has to be a challenge. It has to be a good possibility of failing. And if someone is copying every letter that I'm sending, I feel like I'm doing something wrong. I should be reducing power. I should be increasing the challenge a little bit. And I suppose that's why I'm interested in unusual designs, using things in strange ways, pushing old germanium transistors beyond their limit, or this, for instance, the project on the breadboard is a unijunction, where those were mainly used in the 60s and 70s as relaxation oscillators for low frequency. But, in this particular device, I'm running it at 500 kilohertz I'm frequency locking the relaxation oscillation with a 500 kilohertz quartz crystal, and then I pick off the seventh harmonic, 3.5 megahertz. So it's a strange way to do things, but for some reason, I like the challenge of doing things the hard way.
Well, I'll say, what's the reggae?
The Reggie. I do remember the Reggie. Reggie was named after Reggie, in honor of Reggie Fessenden, the great radio pioneer, Canadian-American radio pioneer. And Mr. Fessenden was he was the inventor of the heterodyne receiver. It was an idea before its time, though, because they didn't have, when he invented the heterodyne, they didn't have a good source of continuous wave energy other than an alternator or an arc transmitter. And those both are fairly unwieldy for a small radio receiver. So the Reggie was a one-transistor oscillator that used a ceramic resonator, 3.58 megahertz ceramic resonator as a VXO, a variable crystal oscillator. It covered the entire 80 meter CW band, put out about 50 to 80 milliwatts from one end of the band to the other. As you know, the VXO, a variable crystal oscillator, the output power tends to change from one end of the range, to the other. But on receive, the Reggie was it was a gainless receiver. There was no gain added, so it was basically on receive. It was a heterodyne mixer. It was a crystal radio basically with a heterodyne. So the challenge there, aside from the QRPP, I suppose I would say 50 to 80 milliwatts, the challenge there was to receive a signal with no added gain. And I made over 400 QSOs with that radio on 80 meters. I was just talking to my friend Dave Benson, K1SWL, the other day about 80 meter DX and how much we enjoy it. And I happened to mention to him that I worked a fellow in the Caribbean with the Reggie, which was my only real DX. But I had a real dance with a fellow in one of the Baltic states. I think it was Lithuania. He was clearly hearing me, and we went back and forth for, it seemed like a long time, but it probably was only a minute. He tried to pick my call out of the noise on 80 meters with that radio, and the closest he got was AA1TJ. So he never copied my call, so I can't call it a contact, but I thought that was pretty cool to be heard on 80 meters with that low of power.
I'm looking at its schematic right now, and literally there's a single 2N2222, like 4 or 5 diodes. I mean, this is an amazingly simple circuit design. What it reminds me, in my mind's eye, what I see these like old tube transceivers, transmitter receivers that were made in the Spark era.
Yes.
It's that simple, and yet it's a transceiver. It's not a transmitter or receiver. It's doing both. That's what's so clever about it. It's so simple on the one hand, and it's so cheap.
Yeah.
On the other hand, for people that say, I can't get on the air for less than a few $100, we're not even looking at $5 of the parts here.
Yeah, that's right. The other thing it used was diode switching, as I remember the radio. I sent it to a fellow the radio that you see on the webpage. I sent that to a fellow, I think, in the Czech Republic, and so presumably he's using it there, or I hope he's enjoying it there. Some years ago, it used diode switching for transmit and receive. I remember that was one of the features. But I had a great time with that radio for sure.
Well, I take it back. It's more than $5 because you have a variable capacitor.
Yeah, when I had a phone call one day by a fellow, his name is Jack. He's the curator of Jack Ward is his name. He's the curator of the Online Transistor Museum. And he's, what a nice fellow. He had seen my webpage, and he was curious if I would be interested in trying to recreate one of the first amateur radio rigs used, transistorized rigs, used on the air to make a contact. And of course, I jumped at the opportunity. So he sent me some very early point contact transistors made by Bell Telephone. These were only slightly removed from the original thing. Remember the piece of plastic with the little cat whisker contacts coming down to it. This was a somewhat refined version of that, but it was still a point contact transistor, so kind of an iffy device at best. So he sent me some of these, and he had no idea if they still worked or not. And I did a little research and found out that the as far as I could tell, the first semiconductor radio made by hams was it was actually a transceiver, a Pixie type transceiver, believe it or not, made by a fellow in England. He worked for I think it was Mullard, maybe. I might have that wrong, but this was in the early 50s. and he had just gotten his hands on one of these transistors from his work and built it into a radio and made some contacts, very local contacts there in the UK. And what was fascinating was he basically built a Pixie, which is, again, it's a transmitter that can be, they improvise a receiver out of the transmitter. And he had done the same thing, and I just thought that was fascinating. The other, around the same time period, there was, oh gosh, I forget his name now, his call sign now, but it was a ham here in the U.S. built, it was an article in QST about it years ago, had also built a transmitter very early, before hams could ever got their hands on these devices. He built a transistorized transmitter on 2 meters of all things at a time when the transistors were still, on fairly low frequency devices. Some point contact transistors were fairly unique in that they could be pushed up to higher frequencies. The junction devices, once the junction devices, which were much more reliable, came about, they had to start over again at much lower frequencies and then work their way up with refinements in the technology.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. You did a great job of citing the history of these devices on your website, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes page. It's interesting that you said that you were going to be a philosophy major and you did that for 2 years, because one of the things that I saw on your website that was remarkable, you write, the British philosopher Frank Ramsey writes, I do not feel the least humble before the vastness of the heavens. The stars may be large, but they cannot think or love, and these are qualities that impress me far more than does size. How does this statement animate your life now and perhaps your approach to amateur radio?
Okay, well, I don't know how far you want me to go off on that tangent, Eric, because I can go for a while. Well, I mean, this is about ham radio, right?
It's about ham radio, but it's interesting. I think we come to ham radio for different reasons along our path. What I was impressed about by looking at your site was the way that you look at ham radio, which is very different from the way that a lot of hams I've met through my 43 years look at ham radio. So this is kind of what rang a bell with me.
Well, let me try to put it this way, Eric. I had a struggle in the early days of my life. I clearly had an interest in engineering, just a real fascination with it. At the same time, I remember telling myself I wanted to do something in my life that really mattered. And for me, engineering, as fascinating as it was a bit utilitarian. It was, I think I had a bias that it was just kind of mundane, which I wanted to do something all-encompassing. Of course, something like philosophy. So what I did was I spent years going back and forth, what should I devote myself to this or that? And in the end, I never ended up doing either one well. How I finally worked it out to myself is, and I have to back up and say, I would get back into ham radio and I'd be really having a great time. And then I would start thinking about it and thinking, what is this all about? What are you doing? What is your goal? What are you aiming to do here? And I would think to myself, really nothing. I'm just, I'm just having a good time. And then I would almost chastise myself for doing so. And then I would put it all away. I would get rid of all my equipment or whatever and concentrate on philosophy or mathematics. So I know this sounds a little wild, I know, but so how I finally worked it out to myself was that what is important in life, and my answer is what is important is just doing what you love, and I don't think there's any way to get beyond that. When you tell your wife that you love her, you don't try to explain why you love her. You would never even think to go there because there really is no adequate why. It's philosophers have written entire books, and I was interested in the philosophy of love for quite a while and read quite a lot on it. So the idea is that there is no going beyond this concept that you don't love this hobby or you don't love this thing that you do in your life for any further reason. It's not a means to another end. It is the end. So the best way I think to spend my life, I've decided, is to do what I love, and one of the things is amateur radio.
If you were looking back on your younger ham radio self, is there anything that you would have done differently? Or something in the hobby that you'd pursue that you're not pursuing now?
I think in order to go back, and if I were to go back and change anything, that would be meddling in the road or the path that I was on that led me to the point where I am. And since I'm so pleased with where I am at the moment, I don't know if I would want to go back and change anything. It's been said that we're basically the history of our mistakes, and if I think about that, everything I've done up to this point has led me to where I am today, and most of what I do is usually wrong. It's always been that way. When I'm going to building a project, most of them do not work. You're only seeing the few successes out of many, many failures. And so I think that's how we learn. And if I were to build something, a cookbook project, out of a textbook, and it would work, I would learn something. But if I were to dream up a circuit and attempt to build it, and have it not work, and maybe work on it and have it work a little better, but still not work, I've learned a great deal, is the way I look at it. So I made a lot of false steps in my ham, hobby. I started and stopped, and then was off the air for a long period of time. But I'm happy with where I ended up. I've made peace with the hobby. I'm not ashamed that I'm a nerd. You're at the same age as Eric, and you remember. I remember when I was in school. I played rugby and I boxed, and I was into bodybuilding and all that. But I had this little secret thing I did. I was almost ashamed to tell other people that I would sneak off to the University Amateur Radio Club station and talk on the radio, and I was almost ashamed that that my friends would know that. But it's at a certain age you get over that, and so I'm very happy with where I am in the hobby today.
I am too. I like getting the blank stares from people when I say, "Oh, I do amateur radio," and they look at me and they say, "Oh, do people still do that?" What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Well, I just follow your interest is all. What other advice would I give? I'm so off on some strange tangent, and happy with where I am. It's just wherever whatever aspect of the hobby, and there's so many possibilities, so many places to to roads to travel in amateur radio. It's such a wide-ranging hobby. Just find find the path that you're interested in, and don't be afraid to change if it's not working out for you. I mean, for instance, when I bought that transceiver, I thought this is what a good ham does, and he aspires to have this really nice transceiver, and it just wasn't working for me. So I changed, and that's the advice I would give to a newcomer: is just do whatever, follow your interests, basically. The old saying is follow your bliss. So that's what I would advise.
Mike, if you have a garden, an antenna, and a library, you have everything you need. Loosely quoting Marcus Tullius Cicero, after all these years in the hobby and in life, do you still believe this?
Well, Eric, I live back in the woods with my wife in a house that I built on a piece of land that we cleared the trees with a 6-foot crosscut saw, no motor attached. I hewed the beams, for the timber frame in my garage out of spruce trees with a broad axe. I dug the foundation for this house that I'm, this masonry house with a pick and shovel. We did everything with our own hands. Vicki and I, my wife and I, came to this piece of land back in 1984, and we've made a very simple life. We probably, I would say 25% of the food we grow. We have a big root cellar. I live a very basic life. I spend very little money. I live on a shoestring, but I don't think I could be happier. I like telling my wife, I think a number of people can say this, is I feel like I've won the lottery. If you have your health and you have someone you love with you, there is nothing else that you could ever hope for. So I am one of the happiest men alive, I think, and I'm very blessed, and I hope other people could feel that as well.
It was Bill, N2CQR, from the Solder Smoke podcast that suggested that I contact you and interview you for the QSO Today podcast. I have to tell you, I feel like I won the lottery today. I really appreciate your coming on to the QSO Today podcast, and with that, I'm going to wish you 73, and I hope that I work you on the air, QRP.
I look forward to it, Eric. It was a pleasure meeting you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mike. Be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in AA1TJ in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at the checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 300. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. Special thanks to Ben Bresky, who now edits the audio for this QSO Today podcast from the audio pieces that I give him. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.